Hey, good morning, guys. It is November 15th, and Chambers is in John 21. It's a really interesting passage, actually. John is writing it, but he's recording a conversation between Peter and Jesus. And when Jesus shares with Peter how he's going to die, what he's going to require of him, after after the challenge of "Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me?" To Peter, and he says, "Feed my sheep," and then Peter immediately says, well, "What about him?" And he's referring to John, who's following closely, and Jesus says, "Don't worry about him. If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you?" And I think it's a really interesting reaction or response from Jesus because don't worry about him. Whatever I want to do with him, that's what I'm going to do. That has nothing to do with you. And so I think it's really interesting. Sometimes we try to put ourselves not in intercession, not like interceding for the life of another, in concern for them, but saying to God, well, that's not their lot. Their lot's not the same as my lot. And Jesus says, don't you worry about that. That's not your concern. Chambers then takes this from this idea of conscious versus unconscious relationship with Jesus, and this ability to kind of allow God to move in the lives of others without us interfering, even with suffering, interfering with the way God's going to work. It's interesting too. Sorry, one little aside. It says Jesus said this. He's talking about Peter being dressed by someone he didn't want to dress him, and being um, going where he didn't want to go. And by this, Jesus said to this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. His death, which was being crucified upside down, would glorify God, which is an interesting point because you would think if someone could jump in and keep Peter from dying that horrible death, that would be an act of service to Peter. But what Jesus is saying is, no, this is what I have for you to glorify me. His death to glorify me. So, not going to that extreme, but maybe sometime that might actually happen. We need to really be careful not to step in right in the middle of God's design for a person, when we are interceding for them. Not to intercede for God's glorification through their life, but to intercede so that God would be glorified. And sometimes intercession means that we pray pain upon somebody for their purification, sanctification, whatever. I don't know. Not actually praying pain upon them, but praying God's will in a way that would glorify Him, and that might be pain. It takes a long time, Chambers says, to realize the danger of being an amateur providence. That is, thinking I'm a little God, interfering, with God's order for others. You see a certain person suffering, and you say, "He shall not suffer. I will see that he does not." Chambers again. You put your hand straight in front of God's permissive will to prevent it, and God says, "What is that to thee?" And I think sometimes we are so quick to identify suffering and be averse to it that we think suffering can never be right. Suffering can never be right. That is sometimes our Western mentality. Suffering can never be right. And God would say, you have a very shallow, immature understanding of the way God's providence works and the way God's glorified. Again, Peter crucified upside down. So many of us would say, no, that's not going to happen. Even the suffering of the church, God uses to glorify Himself. He says a little further down, talking about not interfering, he says, your part is to be so rightly related to God that His discernment comes through you all the time for the blessing of another soul. So, and that's the other thing too, is maybe comfort in the midst of suffering comes through you. Maybe not an elimination of suffering, but comfort in the midst of suffering. And this is tricky, and that's why it's so important, as Chambers says, to have this unconscious, he says, going from a conscious following of Jesus, to this unconscious just being so in line with the will of God that we don't interfere, that we don't jump in. He says at the end here, when we are consciously being used as broken bread and poured out wine, there's another stage to be reached. So when it's just conscious, where all consciousness of ourselves and what God is doing through us is eliminated, it just becomes obedience and service. A saint is never consciously a saint. A saint is consciously dependent on God. And I think I know this is a weakness of mine, is just this idea that I can understand and be so in line with God's will that it becomes very, very unconscious, and even seeing the suffering of others as a blessing from God, or the suffering that God gives me as a blessing and as a work that he's doing to glorify himself. Again, he's not here to glorify us. He's here to be glorified. And so it's not about me. It's not about me. It's not about me. You guys have an awesome day.